She was not the first woman taken, and she would not be the last. In a village where silence was survival and the church bell rang louder than truth, one woman was accused because a crop failed, because a child died, because someone needed to blame someone who could not fight back. Her name was Iselda. She healed the sick. She birthed babies. She once fed the priest's dying dog. But none of that mattered when fear took root. This is not just her story. This is the fate that awaited too many women when caught in medieval Europe. It began the way many endings did, with footsteps in the dark and a fist against the door. Iselda had just extinguished the last candle, her fingers still stained from crushing lavender for a sleep draught, when they came. 3 men with oil lamps, hoods drawn, the priest among them. He did not call her name. He simply pointed, and the other 2 seized her. Her feet dragged in the dirt as her hearth fire died behind her. No one in the village stepped forward, not the midwives she assisted, not the farmer whose fever she broke, not the mother whose breech-born daughter now laughed and ran. They all watched as Iselda was taken. The priest's voice echoed over the crowd. She has cursed our soil. Our children suffer. Her hands are not God's hands. She tried to speak, tried to ask which child, which soil, what curse, but a slap from the elder silenced her. They said her eyes glowed red when she prayed. They said animals died in her presence, that the moon followed her steps, that the bloodline of her mother, long whispered about, had finally borne fruit. Iselda, who had no husband, no father, no son to speak for her, was easy to name and easier to condemn. At the edge of the square, she was tied to a post while the tribunal was summoned. Her dress was torn at the sleeve. Her hair, thick, brown, always braided, was pulled loose, hanging wild down her back. Children stared as if watching a story unfold, not a life unravel. A rooster crowed, though it was long past dawn, and someone muttered that even beasts could smell her sin. She closed her eyes and remembered her mother's voice telling her not to cry in public, never to look afraid. When night fell, the guards returned with iron and rope. They bound her wrists and dragged her to the chapel cellar. The last thing she saw was the old alder tree in the center of the village. A single red ribbon fluttered from its limb, the same kind of ribbon she once tied around newborn wrists to protect them from fever. No one remembered that. No one would say her name tomorrow unless it was in prayer or curse. And below the earth, in that damp stone cell, Iselda waited, not to be forgiven, but to be broken. The room where they judged her was colder than the cell, not because of the stone, but because of the eyes. 3 men sat behind a table draped in black cloth, lit only by one lantern that hung from an iron hook above. Shadows sliced across their faces, but their mouths moved freely. They did not look at her when they spoke, only at their papers, at each other, at the cross nailed above the doorway. Iselda stood barefoot, her wrists still bound, the rope soaked through from last night's rain. They had not fed her. They had not asked her name. "You are accused of unnatural practices," said the eldest, his voice rough with authority but polished like scripture. "You claim to speak with the dead." Iselda opened her mouth, but the guard beside her gripped her arm, and the warning in his fingers was clear: "Speak and bleed." The second man read from a scroll, a litany of vague crimes. Herbs found beneath her cot, marks on her shoulder, a child who claimed she whispered to fire. "Do you deny you consorted with spirits?" Iselda stared at the floor. The third man laughed, low and cruel. "Silence is an answer too, witch." They asked if she'd flown in her dreams, if she remembered her birth under a red moon, if she had ever let a black cat enter her home. These were not questions, they were traps. She knew that now. This was not a trial. It was a drowning where the air was slow and legal. When she looked up, she saw a boy standing at the back, barely 9, maybe 10, hiding behind the pillar. He wore the leather shoes she had made for him last winter. She had stitched them when his feet bled through snow. Now he turned his face away from her, as if ashamed that he remembered. The priest entered then. He did not kneel. He took the 4th seat and nodded solemnly, as if the verdict had already arrived in his sleep. "She is touched by darkness," he said, "not to her, but to the lantern, to the shadows, to God. We saw it in her mother before her. The tongue of the devil is inherited. The others nodded. There was no need for more words. One of the men stood and declared that she would remain imprisoned until she confessed. Not to a specific crime, just confessed. The details could be added later. Your tongue is your key, the priest said, rising. Until you use it, you will rot. She was led away, the iron door slamming behind her like the final page of a book she had never been allowed to write. In the dark again, she sat on the cold floor, back against the wall. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, from memory. She had once told her sister that if the world ever turned against her, she would not give it her voice, and now she wouldn't. They came for her at dawn, though the sun had not yet touched the stone. 2 guards, neither speaking, neither meeting her eyes. One held iron shackles, the other a long strip of wool, torn and dirtied at the ends. Without a word, they tied the wool around her mouth and clamped the irons over her wrists and ankles. Iselda did not resist. She had learned that resistance gave them permission to be crueler. She walked where they pulled her, up through the echoing chapel halls, past flickering torches and the scent of old incense, and into the open light of the village square. A hush fell as they arrived. Morning mist clung to the ground, but the villagers were already gathered, men gripping their belts, women holding their children, a dog barking at the fringe. No one spoke her name. No one asked why. A raised platform had been built from wagon planks and barrels. At its center stood a single wooden post. As they led her up the steps, she saw someone had carved a crude X into the wood deep and dark, as if to mark the spot where souls were unmade. They stripped her of her outer cloak, revealing the shift beneath, still damp from the cell. Her feet were bare. Mud clung to her ankles. One of the guards took the wool from her mouth. A man with ink-stained fingers stepped forward and read from a scroll. In the name of the Father, the Church, and the people of this blessed land, we mark this woman in accordance with the laws of holy protection, that all may know her and none be deceived. The other guard unrolled a small iron brand from a leather pouch. Its tip glowed faintly from the brazier nearby. The symbol was not of any saint or scripture. It was a crude sigil, a spiral crossed by a blade. Iselda had seen it once before, long ago, burned into the flesh of a woman who dared to read. They did not ask her if she understood. The guard pressed the brand against her left shoulder, just below the collarbone. Her teeth clenched, but she did not cry out. The smell of seared skin curled into the morning air. A child in the crowd began to cry. Somewhere, a bird shrieked and flew away. When it was done, they tied her to the post with rough rope, arms raised above her head, the brand still weeping red. "This is penance," the priest intoned, stepping forward. "This is mercy." She stood like that for hours as the sun rose higher. Some villagers spat, some prayed. Most simply watched, as if by looking long enough, they could forget they ever knew her. By the time they untied her and dragged her back to the cell, her legs had gone numb. But her mind had not, and though they tried to mark her as a warning, they had only carved her silence deeper. She would not scream, not yet. The cell beneath the chapel was not empty. When they shoved her through the narrow door, she stumbled forward into the dark and landed beside something warm. Someone. The girl flinched, then scooted back into her corner without a sound. Iselda blinked, trying to see. Faint light slipped through the cracks in the ceiling above, enough to outline 3 other shapes. One sat with her knees tucked to her chest, face hidden in the crook of her elbow. Another lay flat on the stone, unmoving, her breaths shallow and slow like she had practiced disappearing. The third leaned against the wall, head tilted, eyes open but unfocused, as if watching something none of them could see. No one asked her name. No one offered theirs. They did not need to. Each carried the same brand beneath their rags, the same bruises on their wrists, the same silence in their mouths. Time passed without markers, no bell, no sunbeam, only the scraping of rats and the dripping of moisture from somewhere unseen. Hunger dulled into ache. Pain settled into something colder, quieter. On the second day, one of the guards brought water in a chipped clay bowl and slid it across the floor. The mute girl reached for it first, her fingers trembling so badly she spilled half. No one scolded her. No one begged for more. They knew better. That night, the widow began to sing. It was low and broken, not a melody but a thread of sound that looped over itself like an old prayer. She sang about a river no one remembered, about a man who drowned while harvesting reeds. The girl with the faraway eyes smiled faintly. Iselda did not. She remembered that river. She had gathered herbs on its banks with her mother, years before the priest arrived, before Latin was carved into their lives. She touched the burn on her shoulder. The skin had blistered, and the blisters had split. Infection was setting in. She could smell it. None of them were meant to live long. That much was clear now. The cell was not a place of waiting. It was a slow grave. On the third night, a sound echoed through the corridor, wooden steps creaking, keys jangling, breath too even to be fearful. The mute girl began to shake. Iselda reached for her, but she curled away. The door opened. A torch flickered in the frame. The priest entered. Behind him, 2 men in robes carried a box draped in red cloth. He pointed to the widow first. She did not protest. She rose, walked barefoot, and followed them into the corridor like she was heading to market. The door closed. The singing never came back. The girl with the distant eyes whispered. She lasted the longest. Iselda closed her own eyes and said nothing. They would come for her too, but not yet. And when they did, she promised herself she would not walk softly. She would remember every step. They returned at midnight. This time, they called no name. The door swung open without warning, spilling torchlight across the cell floor. The priest did not enter. He simply nodded, and the guards stepped in. Their boots were louder than necessary. One seized the mute girl by the arm. She clawed at the stone, her lips parting in a scream that never came. Iselda lunged forward without thinking, but the second guard struck her across the mouth. Blood filled her cheek. They dragged the girl out by her hair. Her hand reached back, grasping air, until the iron door closed and left silence behind. The cell felt smaller now. The girl with the faraway eyes began humming the widow's song. Iselda sat against the wall, wiping blood from her chin, wondering how many hymns would be born in this pit sung by no one but the doomed. Hours passed, or days. She no longer trusted time. Hunger had become an old companion now, gnawing but dull. When they came for her, it was with ceremony. 2 men in robes, one holding a book, the other a lantern. The priest followed, flanked by 2 guards. "Bring her," he said. She stood without protest. The others did not look at her. They knew looking meant remembering. Remembering meant pain. They led her through corridors she had never seen, twisting tunnels beneath the chapel, their walls wet and lined with rusted tools that glinted like bones. The room they entered was round, domed, candlelit. In its center stood a wooden chair with leather straps, worn and stained from use. A basin of water sat nearby, alongside instruments she did not recognize, hooks, clamps, something that resembled a tongue made of iron. A woman stood in the corner, eyes lowered, holding a cloth. Iselda was guided to the chair. They fastened her wrists and ankles. The priest opened the book and read aloud. "By confession, we cleanse the soul. Through pain, we release the demon." The first question was not spoken. It was struck across her face. The second came with fire. A rod pressed against her thigh, searing through cloth and skin. She bit her tongue. Blood dripped down her chin. "Who taught you the words for summoning?" asked one of the robed men. "What herbs do you place in the mouths of children? How often does the devil lie with you?" Iselda met his eyes and said nothing. They tightened the straps until she could not breathe. They whispered, "Promises confess, and it ends. Confess, and you are forgiven." She thought of her mother's grave, unmarked beneath the alder tree. She thought of the babies she'd delivered, the women she'd healed, the men who came to her in secret and now watched her burn. They brought out the iron tongue. She did not flinch. "We can take your voice," the priest said, "but we cannot make you use it." Iselda smiled, then bloody, split-lipped, hollow. "Exactly." And for the first time, he looked afraid. They forced the confession into her hands the next morning. The parchment smelled of smoke, the ink still damp. The words were already written. Her only role was to speak them aloud. She sat in the corner of the chapel cellar, her body bruised and trembling, her lips cracked from dehydration, and read the script in silence. I called upon the devil under moonlight. I poisoned the milk of the cattle. I laid hands upon the sick, not to heal, but to spread pestilence. Lies, every one of them. Clumsy lies, filled with clichés the church had recycled for generations. She had not danced naked beneath stars, nor kissed the hoof of a demon, nor boiled children's bones. But they did not need truth. They needed ritual. The priest stood nearby, watching her as she read. He did not smile. He did not blink. When she finished, he took the page, folded it twice, and placed it in a wooden box beside the altar. God forgives you now, he said. Your body will burn, but your soul will rise. She wanted to laugh, but had no strength left. Her mouth tasted like iron and ash. They dressed her in white, a simple gown, clean and stiff, unfamiliar against her skin. It had no warmth. The sleeves hung long over her hands. Her hair was brushed, not gently, but methodically until the tangles gave way to a false purity. They tied her wrists with rosary beads and placed a crown of dried lavender on her head. She once used lavender to soothe the dying. Now it would mark her as saved. They marched her through the village as bells rang. Not funeral bells, not mourning bells celebration. The crowd gathered in the square, where the platform had been rebuilt. This time, it held a stake at its center, wrapped in dried vines and kindling. Children sat on shoulders. Women held handkerchiefs to their mouths. Men watched with crossed arms, their expressions unreadable. No one threw stones, no one cursed, but worse, they watched as if witnessing a necessary task. Like a pig being slaughtered for winter, the priest read the confession aloud. Iselda stood still as the flames were lit below her. The fire was slow, too slow. It licked at the base of the post, took time to find the hem of her gown. Smoke rose first, blinding her, clogging her breath. She did not scream, not once. Even as the flames caught her dress, even as heat cracked the skin along her legs and arms, even as her lungs begged for air, the priest looked disappointed. Martyrs were not meant to be quiet. They were meant to wail, to prove the devil feared fire. But Iselda, bound and burning, gave them nothing, not a word, not a cry, just silence, and it was louder than the bells. The morning after the flames died, the ashes were still warm. No one dared touch the stake. Charred and blackened, it leaned slightly to one side, as if bent beneath the weight of her silence. The white gown had left behind threads of fabric curled like dead petals. The lavender crown was gone, consumed entirely. Only the rosary beads remained melted together in a single twisted coil, fused to the wood. The villagers passed by the square that day without speaking. Children were kept indoors. Even the dogs stayed silent. The priest ordered that no relics be taken. To touch her is to invite her stain, he warned. She is forgiven, but she is not remembered. A shallow grave was dug near the edge of the woods, just beyond the reach of consecrated ground. No priest blessed it. No name was carved. She was not given a coffin, only a torn length of cloth wrapped around what was left. At the last moment, a young man from the village, the blacksmith's apprentice, approached the grave with something in his hand. A scrap of ribbon, red, frayed at the ends. One Iselda had once tied around his sister's wrist to ward off sickness. The priest stepped forward to strike it from his hand, but the boy dropped it into the grave first. She helped my family, he said, barely above a whisper, before you said she was anything else. He was whipped that night, twice. But the ribbon stayed buried with her. That should have been the end. But 2 nights later, someone whispered that the priest had gone pale during evening mass, that he had forgotten the words to the benediction and fled the chapel mid-prayer. The next morning, his chamber door remained shut. By evening, the guards broke it down and found him curled beneath his altar, muttering fragments of Latin and clawing at his own chest as if trying to dig something out. He never spoke again. They called it fever. But those who had watched the fire closely, those who had seen the way the flames twisted away from her face, the way her lips never parted, knew better. They began to murmur. Just small things. A cracked rosary bead found beneath a pillow, a smudge on the church wall that looked like a woman's profile, lavender blooming out of season near the grave. And then the dreams began. The women who had turned away in the square began to wake in the night, choking on smoke. Children spoke of seeing a woman in white walking past their windows, her hair long, her mouth closed, always closed. The silence had returned, but now it walked. It watched, it waited, and those who had once chanted for her death found themselves listening for sounds that never came: footsteps, breath, forgiveness. But Iselda had left them nothing, only her silence, and it would outlive them all. Years passed, but her name was never spoken again in the village, at least not above a whisper. The chapel was repainted, its stones scrubbed until the scent of smoke vanished. A new priest was sent from the north, younger, eager, unaware of what had curled into the bones of that place. He asked once why the east pew was always empty, why the bell rope was replaced every season though no one rang it. The villagers only shook their heads and told him to keep his sermons short. But beneath the chapel, behind a false wall in the storage cellar, something remained. A child discovered it first, chasing a dropped spindle through the cracks. A hollow space, a creaking door. Inside, a box of letters, pressed between stones like something meant to rot and yet still breathing. The pages were brittle, ink faded but legible. They were written in a careful hand, hers. Not spells, not curses, just records, names, dates, treatments, births, deaths, the real history of the village, not the version rewritten by men in robes. Every woman she had helped, every child she had saved, every truth they had burned with her body. At the bottom of the stack was one final page, written in blood, not ink. The lines were crooked, hastily scrawled, as if made with a finger rather than a quill. "They will not let me speak," it read. "But I remember, and I will be remembered," the child told her mother. The mother told no one, but she sewed a red thread into the lining of her daughter's dress that night. And from then on, every girl born in that village carried a thread. Some wore it as bracelets, some braided it into their hair, some tied it around door handles when a baby was sick, or when a woman bled too long. They did not say her name, but they carried her defiance. And the silence she left behind grew teeth. A man's crops failed, he claimed, his neighbor cursed them, but no one came. A girl vanished into the forest for 2 nights and returned with wildflowers and mud in her hair. She smiled, and no one asked where she had been. The land changed, but the shadow remained, not as fear but as warning, a quiet power, older than sermons, stronger than shame. Eventually, the church collapsed in a storm. They tried to rebuild it, but every stone laid cracked within days. The site was abandoned. Grass overtook the graves. Moss swallowed the nameplates, but under one alder tree, red ribbons still fluttered when the wind blew just right. Some claimed they saw a woman in white standing there at dusk, her mouth closed, her eyes calm, not angry, not vengeful, just watching, as if waiting to see if the world had finally learned, or if it would need to burn again. If you believe her story should never be forgotten, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still listens to silence. Welcome to Forgotten Stories' ancient world.